In Africa today, most leaders love the spotlight. They give speeches, post online, and chase headlines. But one young man, Captain Ibrahim Traoré, doesn't say much. He doesn't dress fancy. He doesn't attend big meetings. He doesn't even mention Kenya. And still, his silence is shaking the powerful. Just last month, Kenya's top government official took a jab at Ibrahim Traoré. Let's see the clip.
Captain Ibrahim Traoré. I used to also fall for his hype. First of all, I am not a fan of coups. I am a firm believer in democracy. I strongly believe that if there were lesser coups in Africa and more transitions by the ballot, Africa will advance.
So now we ask, why does a quiet soldier from Burkina Faso scare one of East Africa's strongest governments? Why does his name, never said out loud, feel louder than a riot? Here's the truth. Kenya isn't scared of a war. They're scared of being exposed. Because Captain Traoré doesn't threaten the state. He threatens the lie. The moment didn't happen at a protest. It wasn't at a funeral. It happened during a normal sitting in the Kenyan Senate. While thousands of young Kenyans were protesting in the streets, the government was meeting in Parliament. That's when Aaron Cheruiyot, the Senate Majority Leader, stood up to speak. Instead of talking about the deaths and pain the youth were going through, he aimed his words at a man far away, Captain Ibrahim Traoré of Burkina Faso. This is what he said. Captain Ibrahim Traoré, I used to also fall for his hype. First of all, I am not a fan of coup. I am a firm believer in democracy. I strongly believe that if there were lesser coups in Africa and more transitions by the ballot, Africa will advance better than it is doing through coups and by the power of the bullet. He said it clearly. No code, no guessing. He named Traoré directly. But Traoré hadn't said anything about Kenya. He didn't speak about the protests. He didn't even respond to the insult. So why bring him up? Because while Kenyan youth were marching with signs that said, "We are hungry," many of them were also sharing videos and quotes of Traoré online. They were comparing Kenya's leaders, who raise taxes and silence protests, to a young soldier who builds farms, opens clinics, and speaks less, but does more. And in that moment, the Kenyan government showed it wasn't just fighting protests, it was fighting a comparison. As protests continue to spread across Kenya, one question stands out. Why are government officials choosing to focus on Captain Ibrahim Traoré of Burkina Faso, a leader with no direct ties to Kenya's internal affairs, at a time of national unrest? The answer, analysts suggest, lies in a familiar political strategy: distraction. Governments under pressure often redirect public attention, and right now Kenya is under immense pressure. Since the announcement of the 2024 finance bill, the country has seen an unprecedented wave of protests, led largely by Gen Z citizens. In response to the bill's heavy tax increases, demonstrations have erupted nationwide, met with tear gas, arrests, and, in some cases, deadly force. More than 100 young protesters have reportedly been killed. Increased taxes on internet and essential goods have placed new burdens on already struggling families. The cost of living has skyrocketed, with food, fuel, and basic supplies now out of reach for many. This backlash has been particularly painful for the same young people who helped elect President William Ruto in 2022. Drawn to his promises of economic fairness and representation for the so-called hustler nation. But 2 years later, many of those supporters now find themselves on the receiving end of state violence. Instead of addressing these growing concerns head-on, Kenya's leadership has shifted focus to a foreign figure, Captain Traoré, whose name is gaining traction in local protests and online discourse. By invoking his image, officials may be attempting to reframe the conversation, casting suspicion on outside influences, rather than confronting the deep dissatisfaction brewing at home. Political observers say it's a tactic rooted not in national security, but in political survival. When systems are overwhelmed, blaming outsiders is often easier than facing the hard questions within. When William Ruto was elected president in 2022, he styled himself as the hustler's president, a leader for the ordinary citizen, promising to champion the working class and end elite capture. But within 2 years, that image began to fracture. By 2024, his administration had introduced a wave of tax increases on essential goods. Fuel, maize flour, sanitary products, and even internet access. These measures, justified by the government as necessary for economic recovery, hit Kenya's poorest communities the hardest. While cabinet members moved around in state-funded convoys, many young Kenyans, the same demographic that helped carry Ruto to power, were in the streets protesting with signs that read, "We are hungry." In stark contrast stands Captain Ibrahim Traoré, the 36-year-old leader of Burkina Faso. He governs a country under sanctions, facing internal conflict and persistent insecurity. Yet despite limited resources and international pressure, Traoré has prioritized practical results over political performance. His administration has committed nearly $1 billion to food sovereignty, aimed at helping Burkina Faso grow what it eats and reduce reliance on imports. He has nationalized the country's gold sector, ending foreign control over key mining operations. Foreign troops guarding extraction sites were asked to leave, and that control was handed back to the state. Land has been redistributed to farmers, widows, and local communities, with a focus on restoring dignity and livelihoods. Crucially, Traoré has achieved this without relying on IMF loans, foreign grants, or high-level summits. His leadership has been defined not by speeches or campaigns, but by action on the ground. The contrast has not gone unnoticed, especially among African youth who are growing increasingly frustrated with leaders who talk reform but deliver austerity. For many, the symbolism is clear. One leads with promises, the other with proof. Captain Ibrahim Traoré has made no public comments about Kenya. He hasn't attacked its government, nor responded to Senate Majority Leader Aaron Cheruiyot's criticism. There have been no statements, no jabs, no involvement. But his leadership, grounded, quiet, and focused on domestic development, is increasingly being viewed as a reflection Kenya's government would rather not confront. The contrast is not simply about style, it's about substance. Traoré governs under sanctions and pressure, yet continues to implement policies that directly address the needs of his people. His refusal to rely on foreign debt or Western approval has struck a chord across Africa, especially among young people tired of promises and poverty. Among many African youth, Traoré is no longer just a military figure. He represents a challenging question. If someone with less money, less peace, and less global support can still deliver for his people, what's stopping our own leaders? In that light, the threat isn't that Traoré will influence Kenya politically. The threat is the comparison and the growing sense that things could be different. So the question now being raised by observers is clear. Why has Captain Ibrahim Traoré become a point of discomfort for Kenya's leadership? According to political analysts and civil society voices, the answer may lie in the growing contrast between governance styles. While Kenya's government continues to issue statements and defend its policies, Traoré's administration in Burkina Faso is being widely noted for focusing on practical outcomes. From building clinics and distributing land to rejecting foreign loans and investing in food sovereignty. Public sentiment, especially among Kenya's youth, reflects frustration. Many see a government that asks for patience while offering few visible results. At the same time, online discourse increasingly highlights Traoré as a figure of action, someone achieving results despite leading a country under far more difficult conditions. Critics argue that this comparison has become uncomfortable for Kenya's political class. Traoré hasn't directly spoken about Kenya, yet his leadership has created a new standard, one that for many citizens highlights the gap between what is promised and what is delivered. And in a country where over 100 young protesters have lost their lives in recent months, some Kenyans say they don't need slogans or sympathy. They need results. For them, the real threat isn't a soldier in Burkina Faso. It's the growing belief that things could and should be different. But despite those obstacles, many across Africa now view him as a symbol of what leadership could look like when it is grounded in delivery rather than performance. Analysts say his approach, focused on farming, local investment, and state ownership, stands in contrast to the polished images and public relations common in many other governments on the continent. For citizens watching from across Africa, particularly in countries facing economic hardship and political unrest, the comparison is becoming harder to ignore. This moment is not about coups or military rule versus civilian governance. It is, as many young Africans are now saying online, about who is actually feeding their people and who is feeding them excuses. Whether Captain Traoré's leadership will succeed long-term remains to be seen. But for now, he has become a reference point, not for revolution, but for results. And that, more than any speech or summit, is what appears to be shifting the conversation across the continent.